Hello, my name is Nick Norby, and I'm the host of History Up in Smoke, cigar chat of classical icons, where I talk about individuals from all epochs of history. In this installment, I'm going to be talking about one of the most famous individuals in all of human history, Saul of Tarsus. You might know him better as the Apostle Paul or Saint Paul, but he was almost single-handedly responsible for starting one of the largest religious phenomenons the world has ever known. But before we talk about Paul, let's go grab a cigar. I decided to go with the Davidoff Royal Release. It is a Robusto. They make two different formats of this. Like I said, this one is the Robusto, but they also make the Salomones, which is a double Corona. And according to Davidoff, this cigar was 10 years in the making from seed to cigar. So I'm really looking forward to trying this. Never tried one before, but it's 5.5 inches in length. You can see it just looks absolutely beautiful. Has a 55 ring gauge, so it's a rather girthy cigar, and just a silky smooth wrapper. And just get a little smell of it here. Smells kind of like hay, a little bit of a leather note to it as well. And yeah, that's really about all I'm picking up on it as well. One thing I should note as well, that Davidoff used 8 of their best rollers who have a minimum of 15 years experience to construct and craft this cigar. And they wanted to make sure that the cigar had a flawless draw and perfect construction. And I'm going to tell you something. Davidoff, one thing that they are very characteristic of is their flawless draws. In fact, sometimes their draws can be a little too loose on the end of the spectrum to where people actually have little fits about that. But they wanted to make sure that this cigar is, like I said, it's a premium cigar, but they wanted to make sure that it was just flawlessly constructed. And you can just see that they paid a lot of attention to the detail of it. And my goodness, I've never had one of these, like I said, and it's an ultra premium cigar that I would smoke only on a special occasion. And real quick too, this is 5 different blends of tobacco. Interestingly enough, this is all blends from the Dominican Republic. Even the wrapper is from the Dominican. The only thing that is not from the Dominican is the binder, which is right underneath the wrapper, and that is from Ecuador. But this is a relatively expensive cigar, and like I said myself, it's not something that I would smoke on a weekly basis. I don't have the kind of funds for this because it's about $80 a stick. And if you go with the Salomones, which like I said, is a little bit larger, you're going to be paying upwards to over $100 for that stick. So this is a special occasion cigar, and I'm with some special friends. So that's why I wanted to smoke this and give it a try. And I'm going to go ahead and get it cut up, and we'll get started here. And if you're new to the channel, oh, actually, I almost forgot. I wanted to mention something. I'm going to be giving one of these away. Obviously brand new in the wrapper, sealed. That's the way Davidoff does all of them. They put them in cellophane. But in my next installment, which is going to be on William Billy Lee, I'm going to have a drawing for one of these. The way you enter is really quite simple. All you have to do is like the video, and you get 1 entry. If you comment, you get a 2nd entry. And if you subscribe, you get a 3rd entry. So you have 3 chances to get your name on one of these. And on my next installment, when like I said, on William Billy Lee, I'll have a live drawing for that on there as well. So just keep that in mind as we get a little bit closer to releasing that. This one looks like it has a triple cap. I'll be a little cautious here cutting it. Maybe get off a little bit more here. Now, as most of you know, I really enjoy relaxing with a good cigar. Well, that's perfect right there. And I like talking about history as well. And, you know, when I think about history, I think it's incumbent on anyone that wants to get involved with it or engage and learn more about history is to do their due diligence. And the way that you do that is to sort of ask questions or get into the mind of the individual that you're studying. And I think that's important. And what you can do is, there's obviously a couple ways. You can read literature about that person, maybe perhaps a biography, or you could read letters that they wrote, something of that nature, or you could listen to me. I prefer you do the latter. I'm just kidding. If you like to read, that's absolutely wonderful. But I like to do that myself. I like to read. I do it in my free time. And I like to just talk about what I read. And in this case, like I said, when we're doing history, we want to ask the questions. We want to get into the mind of the individual that we're studying as much as possible. And we need to remember something, that they lived in a completely different world than you and I do today. Let me rephrase that. They live in a totally different world than you and I do. And I mean, I think even if you go back to, say, our country's foundings, if you go back about 2.5 centuries ago, they were diametrically different than you and I were. I mean, and if you go back 2,000 or 3,000 years, my goodness, yes, they were human beings, and they shared some of the exact same characteristics with us, but they did stuff so differently that, my goodness, most of us wouldn't make it past noon with them. Oh, by the way, this cigar smells so good right now. I haven't even taken a puff. Not even a draw yet. I've just been heating that up on the end. Look at the smoke output that's given off. It's absolutely wonderful. This is almost ready. But oh. That's good. Yeah, we're digressing a little bit. This is a good cigar. My goodness, this right now, that first draw and pull, first of all, draw was absolutely flawless. Second, the flavors that were coming through on that first draw, mind-boggling. It was sweet. There was a little bit of a tangy zest to it, a little bit of pepper. Very, very good cigar on the initial draw. Okay, I got to get back to what we were talking about. We were talking about if you go back 2,000 or 3,000 years, and yes, they were very, very different than us. And tonight, I want to bring us back several thousand years, and I want to talk about an individual by the name of Saul of Tarsus. Might be one of my favorites ever. I know I say that a lot, but I honestly mean it. This is a really good cigar. Really good cigar. In fact, I reviewed a Cohiba Talisman on my last one on the death of George Washington. Right now, no comparison. Not even close. Not even close. But we'll let this progress and see how it is. But I want to bring us back to, like I said, 2,000 years ago with an individual by the name of Saul of Tarsus. You may know him as the Apostle Paul or Saint Paul even. And he is an absolutely fascinating individual. And you know what? It doesn't matter what your position is with regard to religion. Whether you're an agnostic, an atheist, a Hindu, a Muslim, whatever. This guy, I think it would be safe to say that he had one of the most dramatic, life-altering changes in human history. I think it's on, if you've ever heard of the thing, I had a Damascus Road experience or something to that effect. That's referring to St. Paul. And when we talk about his just the cataclysmic event that happened in his life, how it altered and shifted the way he thought, it's absolutely fascinating. And you can believe what you want, with regard to what actually happened to him on the Damascus Road. You could say, it was an epiphany, it was a vision, it was a hallucination, whatever you believe it was fascinating. And he actually documents this, little nuggets of it in some of his letters. And it's documented quite well in Acts of the Apostles, which is attributed to the author Luke. But speaking of letters, this is also important because I think that Paul was arguably one of, if not one of the greatest authors of antiquity, perhaps in all of human history. When you compare him to some of his contemporaries like Ovid, Pliny, Cicero, Plutarch, I mean, Paul was a towering intellect that stands head and shoulders above these individuals. He was just that intelligent. His use of rhetoric, his use of philosophy that he had a lot of access to, and just the way that he wrote to some of the churches and individuals is very, very interesting material that I think is worth reading. Again, whether or not you're religious or not, it's very, very interesting material. So we're going to talk more about Paul. I want to give a little bit of a background about him. But first, I want to enjoy a little bit more of this because this is spectacular. Insane smoke output. Wonderful cigar, flawless draw. It's not the most expensive Davidoff, believe it or not. There's a Davidoff Oral Blanco, which retails for $500, way out of my league. I'm never going to pick up something like that. But for $80 on a very special occasion, yeah, this is worth every penny so far. Absolutely loving it. Silky smooth smoke, nice, very, very smooth draw. Has a very sweet note to it, a little bit of pepper on the finish, and a little bit of a leather note to it as well. So I'm really digging this cigar so far. I'm impressed, to say the least. Now, getting back to where we were talking about Saul of Tarsus. Fascinating individual. Born in the years probably 4 to 6 AD, somewhere in there. We don't actually know for certain when Saul was born, but he was from the city of Tarsus. Now, when I say Tarsus, a lot of people today, they kind of look at you like, well, where's that at? Here's something interesting to know. You know, you think of the city of Rome, when I talk about ancient history, you think of Athens, you think maybe Jerusalem, places like that, or Cairo. A lot of times Tarsus doesn't get mentioned, but I want to tell you something. It was one of the most famous cities in the ancient world. It was very well known for its philosophical schools that was second only to Athens. So think about Saul growing up in this environment. He would have had access to a lot of the philosophers and things that were taught during that time. But it was also right on the other side, the eastern side of the Cilician Gates. Now, unless you were traveling to the east or the Middle East by water, your only land way to travel to the east was through the Cilician Gates. It was a very small opening that was surrounded by the Tarsus Mountains. And as soon as you got through the Cilician Gates, guess what? There was the city of Tarsus. So it was really where east met west. And you had just this huge people coming from all different nationalities and countries going back and forth from the east to the west. And so there was a lot of different cultures and ideas that were going around that, again, Paul would have had access to. Now, you got to remember something as well, that Saul was a Jew. But he wasn't just any Jew, he was a Jew that was a Roman citizen. He probably gained his citizenship as a Roman through his father in the late 1st century BC when Rome was settling a lot of the colonies. And the Romans needed tents for their soldiers, and that's what Saul's father did. He was a tent maker, so he was probably providing tents for the Romans, and in lieu of that, he was awarded citizenship. So again, at a very young age, Saul had a lot of advantages. He was a Roman citizen, he had access to great philosophers, and he was bilingual at minimum. He knew Aramaic and he knew Greek fluently, but he probably knew quite a bit of Latin as well, and he could read in Hebrew. And it wasn't long after his bar mitzvah that the young Saul traveled to Jerusalem, and this is where he would get his training as a Pharisee under the great teacher Gamaliel. And this was also where he would become very zealous for his faith, his Jewish faith. These roots became, they started to really grow up in Saul, where he became very zealous. And he became extreme, some would certainly say. He would later write in one of his letters to the church in Philippi that he was a zealous persecutor of the Christians, and that with regard to the law, he was blameless. So, shortly after the death of Jesus of Nazareth, under the prefect, and this is by crucifixion, Pontius Pilate, because of sedition, that Jesus was trying to undermine the Roman authorities and claimed that he was a king. That's why he was really crucified. A small movement was ignited at this point in time. Now, it was very small to say the least, but it started to gain a little bit of traction. And initially, not much was thought of it. It was really thought of as sort of a derivative of Judaism at the time, or a sect. You think of like Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism, Baptist, so on and so forth. They're just different sects of the same faith of Christianity. And that's what this was recognized as. And Judaism was a legally practiced religion under Roman rule. The Romans said, hey, look, if you want to practice Judaism, by all means go ahead, because the Jews were so stubborn. They would not bow down to the gods of the Romans. The Romans would put their feet on their necks, and the Jews would gladly die for their faith. And finally, the Romans just gave up, and they sort of said, okay, go ahead and worship your God, but if you'd be so kind to pray for our gods, we would appreciate that. So it became a legal religion of the day. But pretty soon, these followers of what came to be known as the Way, it was still not known as Christianity, they began to contradict some of the laws of Judaism, especially when it started to get into the outer parts with Gentiles, non-Jews becoming involved. They started to disregard circumcision, the dietary laws, Sabbath observance, cleanliness laws. They were rejecting a lot of these ideas. And above all, both the Jews and the Gentiles started to call on the name of Jesus. Now that's sort of a euphemism of praying to Jesus, and only God was to be prayed to. So this was a big problem for Saul in Jerusalem. When he saw this, this is what made him very upset. And we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail after I have some more of this cigar. Excellent cigar, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely loving it. Razor sharp burn. Hasn't changed a whole lot in flavor. If I had to say strength-wise, maybe a medium body at best. At least for myself, it's not overpowering at all. Very sweet with just light pepper, hints of leather. Absolutely loving it. And I don't want to digress too far from where we were with our friend Saul, who had just recently grown extremely upset by what these individuals were doing by calling on the name of this Jesus fellow instead of Yahweh alone, who is the God of the Hebrews. But really in a desperate attempt to reel his countrymen back, again from this Jesus heresy, Saul began to advocate for the use of force. And there was even one of the believers of this following of Jesus by the name of Stephen. It got so bad that he was stoned for what he believed about Jesus. And Saul actually stood by and he advocated for this. He believed that this was okay because what this individual was doing was committing blasphemy, and it was the worst crime that you could do if you were an individual that was Jewish or a believer in Yahweh. And what really commenced after that, to use sort of a semi-modern metaphor, was a witch hunt. And this really sent a lot of these individuals that believed in Jesus as God scattering to different parts, kind of their own little mini diaspora, if you will. A lot of them actually would go to Syria, Antioch, but many of them to Damascus as well, which was all north of Jerusalem. And basically, Paul by this time had gotten permission from the high priest to do whatever he could to capture these individuals and put this rebellion out by whatever means necessary. And Saul set out to do that. And this is where it just gets strange. This is one of the strangest stories that I think has ever happened. It's documented 3 times actually in Acts of the Apostles, once by the author, I think around chapter 8 or 9. but then twice by Paul himself when he's standing before Felix and then later on Festus and Agrippa. And he talks about this story, but it's strange because of the ramifications of it. Number one, and I want to try and contextualize this as best as possible to really get us to be able to grasp this. But you have to think of how zealous Paul was for his belief and his practices of Judaism. Like I said, he said himself that he exceeded all of his contemporaries, that he was more religious, obeyed the law better, was flawless with regard to this. And to really understand the magnitude of this, the only example I could think of was to go back to 9/11. If you're old enough to remember that, you probably remember where you were, what happened on that horrible day, the worst attack ever on American soil, killed thousands of people. But the mastermind behind it was Osama bin Laden. And this was an individual who also had a hate for Christians, but Americans and the American way as well. Now, imagine for a moment that suddenly, before the attacks, bin Laden reforms his ways. And he tells his men before the attack, I'm a Christian now. Probably not going to go over too well. In fact, I don't think that would have happened. But you can see, like, I'm trying to draw somewhat of a comparison to help us grasp the magnitude of this, because this was a cataclysmic event that shook Saul to the very core of his being. And it was so strong, I don't think he could have said no if he wanted to. But what else is fascinating was what this man was able to accomplish. My goodness, with the time that he was given, from about the years 46 to 57, this guy traveled at minimum 10,000 miles. Let me give you an example of that. That's like walking from New York to LA and back 4 times. That's a lot of miles. And the guy's message was like a depth charge that was dropped miles below into the sea and explodes and just ripples up in every single direction. And it's been doing that, sending those ripples out for thousands of years, right up to our current epoch of time. So it was a strong message that penetrated the core of human beings and what they believed and their existence and so on and so forth. So now, had Saul not complied with this message, or had he been stopped, as we're going to discuss here momentarily, Christianity would not be what it is today. There's not a chance it would. If Paul would have been stopped, I have to believe that this would have been relegated to just another small religious sect in Jerusalem, and it would have remained confined to that area. But the guy his message was so powerful, like I said, that he almost single-handedly revolutionized the way people thought and believed about God, and his message was so powerful. Now, what's also interesting, let's get to the narrative. What actually happened? Well, as it's recorded in Acts of the Apostles, it's a pretty brief description of what happened. Saul was traveling north from Jerusalem to Damascus, and it was around noon, he says, that a bright light, so bright it knocked him to the ground. He said it was brighter than the sun. And there were people that were with him, and this happened to them as well. They got knocked right to the ground. So this would sort of rule out a hallucination. You know, Paul did not hallucinate and believe that he had some type of encounter when there were other people with him. Group hallucinations just don't happen. But the voice says to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he responds and says, "Who are you, Lord?" He says, "I am Jesus who you are persecuting." Now, if this isn't the irony of ironies, I don't know what is. The very person whose name Saul was trying to blot out because he viewed it as blasphemous is now recruiting him to be his spokesperson or mouthpiece. It's it's hard to comprehend. It really is. But after Saul had this encounter, he was blind. He needed to be led into Damascus, and we're told that he was led into a street called Straight Street, and it still exists to this day. And after 3 days, he regained his sight and he was able to see. And he was sort of a new man, if you will. And I want to talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes at the transformation that took place in him.